Welcome back. Joining me now is economics professor Gigi Foster. Gigi, much has been made by this federal government about their future Made in Australia policy. I've not met anyone who can use a calculator who thinks it's a good idea to simply create industry dependent on government handouts. Has Labor jumped the shark with this one?
Hi, Caroline. Great to speak with you. Interesting expression, jump the shark. I do reckon it has been done before, but not in this sort of situation. So we have had situations in history, for example, Singapore, where a government chose a particular industrial policy and invested heavily in infant industries in order to bring the society up to an international competitive standard and then got out of the way and let the market take over. I have not seen that as a trajectory that the government is planning on this Made in Australia package, which is interesting and quite similar to the US Inflation Reduction Act in the sense that the label on the legislation is quite different from the actual meat of the legislation, which really has to do with these quote unquote green energy handouts. So if I really wanted to believe the government that this is a positive industrial policy to invest in Australia's future in a way that will get us to the frontier internationally of, say, solar and wind production and batteries, then I would see an end game, and that I don't see.
And while this is something a little bit different, I love this Canadian political cartoon from last week, which I think broadly sums up the stupidity of gratuitous government intervention. The taxpayer is footing the bill for all this largesse after all. But relevantly for Australian purposes, a news poll from the weekend shows that voters appear to support Labor's future Made in Australia policy. Now, I note that the poll question commences with the Australian government should actively invest in. Do you think the response from voters would have been different if the question commenced the Australian taxpayer should actively subsidise?
Look, perhaps. I do think that the level of economic literacy in the country is quite woeful, and I'm trying to do everything I can to fix that, but it's difficult. People don't seem to really understand that when a dollar is spent by the government, that's not only a dollar that's coming out of their pocket, but it's also a dollar that doesn't get spent on anything else. So if I were Albo or policymakers trying to invest in things that will really help Australians, I would be thinking about things like bringing clean water to rural communities in the country, how to maybe green our oceans and get plastic out of the oceans, maybe how to invest in the development of drought-resistant crops. There are things that one could do, also building on some of the comparative advantages that Australia has. But I don't see that the green energy package has that. But unfortunately, as you say, a lot of Australians do like the sound of green energy. They just like the idea. I think it makes them feel good. They think they're saving the climate just by believing in this clean energy religion, really. And so unfortunately, that crowds out real discussions, hard discussions, like the one you had with your previous guest, about the real costs and benefits to the Australian people of the various energy investment policy choices that we have on the table.
And do you think that partially perhaps it's a question about education, but do you also think partially it's, I suppose, the consequence of a country like Australia having too much and having had it too good for too long?
Yeah, the lucky country is a curse, right? I definitely think that there's something deep in the Australian culture that leads people to look to government to fix problems when things get really hard. We saw that in COVID, and we're seeing it again now. And indeed, this whole Made in Australia policy has some similar hallmarks to what the COVID lockdown policy had. It says, let's have a big sacrifice, which is higher energy costs and less reliable energy for the promise of some unseen but computer modeled benefit. And unfortunately, in the case of the COVID lockdowns, that didn't work out so well. COVID came in anyway, and the international literature just accumulates every week showing how bad lockdowns were as a policy. And indeed, they were rejected back as early as 1850. We just forgot about that by public health. So I fear the same for this Made in Australia policy. I wish we could have more sensible, reasoned debates about the costs and benefits of various policy options. But unfortunately, people, as you say, are kind of used to just looking to government, and they can be drawn in by these pretty packagings that the government comes up with. And by the way, Albo came up with, this party came up with the Made in Australia moniker, not just recently, but as far back as June 2022. So it has been in the cooks for quite a while.
Yeah, I wonder whether Australians will work it out at some point. But like I discussed with my last guest, you know, some of this stuff ends up being operational costs baked into the budget well into the future. And if we don't get it right, not only do we have the initial consequences of it, but when this is debt, when there is interest on it, you're suffering the consequences of this well into the future, aren't you?
You're so right, Caroline. And again, that was the same thing with the COVID lockdowns and the job keeper policies that followed, all the stimulus. That was one of the main points that I made in the cost benefit analysis of lockdown policies that I wrote with Sanjeev Sablock back in 2022. We basically tried to estimate the total cost, and you cannot just look at the period of lockdowns. You must look into the future and to all of the things that the government cannot invest in the future because of the fact that they're paying off the debt. But unfortunately, that doesn't appear on anybody's spreadsheet. It doesn't actually materialize. It's basically a future we never had because we made bad decisions. And to really appreciate that, you need to have a little bit of economic understanding, a little bit of sang-froid, a little bit of ability to address policy choices and scarcity in an adult fashion. And unfortunately, I don't see much of that today, either amongst our politicians or honestly amongst some of the people on the street.
Now, on to Tesla, and it's a company which is always interesting to watch. And in recent days, it's slashed the price of a number of models due to a slump in demand. Now, we've become a society which values convenience, and there's a lot of inconvenience associated with EVs. Have consumers removed their rose-coloured glasses finally?
I do think it's possible we could be past peak EV in Australia, possibly. There is obviously a role for electric vehicles in certain areas of the economy, but I think just as you were discussing with your last guest, there's a limit to the fraction of the total market that can economically and sensibly be taken up by EVs. So you may have some people doing it, but as you know, there are many anecdotes now floating around about horrible situations with running out of charge and being unable to charge quickly, or very, very heavy vehicles catching fire on ferries and whatnot. And of course, the maintenance costs, which are greatly higher than a lot of the traditional gas-fired or diesel-fired engines. And because, those things really matter to consumers. It's not just the sticker price. It is the convenience. It is the ongoing ability to be efficient in your everyday life. And if you're not efficient, it's not just a case of trying to chase the lowest possible cost. It's a case of having to spend time and energy and money doing things that could be spent on something else. So instead of waiting around 3 hours for your vehicle to charge, you could be reading to your child or taking a course or something else. So again, it's the notion of what do we give up when we spend on this inconvenient and high cost, ideologically driven, I think, investment in a lot of cases.
And the demand for EVs here and elsewhere, look, it's largely propped up by tax breaks and other types of government support. How fragile is this market if that government support is withdrawn?
I think we wouldn't have many sales at all. And it's actually interesting you mentioned that, Caroline, because I think another thing in terms of economic literacy that people forget is that when government comes in and throws money at something in order to get it going, what does that tell you? It tells you that the market didn't get it going in the first place, right? So it should always be a clue that, maybe this area of investment is actually not particularly economic. Maybe it doesn't make sense to do it. And there are plenty of areas where the market has discovered that there are opportunities, like, for example, using AI in diagnosis, let's say. That's something where the private market's quite interested. How about the Australian government invest in that? If we want to get skilled labor and manufacturing and even just high skill services here in Australia again, why not look to where the market thinks there's an opportunity and then follow that with some time-limited government support? That would be a much more sensible strategy, I think, for investing in Australia's future.
You would think so. You would think so. Gigi Foster, thank you so much for your time.